Hello, everybody, and welcome to topic 1.1 of APES Introduction to Ecosystems. So, our goals for today are to learn how ecosystems are the result of biotic, meaning living, and abiotic interactions, or non living parts of the ecosystem, and be able to explain how the availability of resources influences species interactions. Now, we're going to be looking at predator prey relationships, parasite host relationships, different forms of symbiosis, including mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism, as well as analyzing how competition works and how resource partitioning works. Now, ecosystems are particular locations on Earth with the interacting biotic, which is the living portions of the environment, and the abiotic or non living components of the ecosystem. The characteristics are highly dependent on how the climate exists and on that location, usually dependent on latitude, how far away from the equator they are. Differences in temperature, precipitation, and other factors are going to control who can live and survive in those different ecosystems. Not every species can survive in every ecosystem. Ecology is the study of these ecosystems, but also within that field, we have community ecology, which is the study of interactions among these different species. Now, when it comes to ecosystems, it can be very difficult to define boundaries. What we often look at is biotic and abiotic components and how we define the boundaries of an ecosystem, and mainly using plant life and things like that. Some have well-defined boundaries, like lakes and ponds, are very easy to define their limits. However, others, like let's say the National Park at Yellowstone, don't have an easily defined boundary. Each ecosystem interacts with its surrounding ecosystem, so it may be hard to define these boundaries, but we analyze the entire biosphere in order to try and look at the different biomes and then smaller habitats and ecosystems that exist within each one. Now, the biosphere is all the livable portions on the Earth, where every living thing on Earth resides, and it's not very big in terms of the scale of the Earth. It's only 20 kilometers or 12-mile thick layer around Earth. Basically, think of it as if you sliced an apple in half and looked at it from the side. That thin layer of skin around the side would be the equivalent of the biosphere to Earth. Very small portion of overall Earth is actually capable of supporting life. Now, these boundaries can be managed, such as national parks, which are set to administrative standards, like that would be political, economic, in terms of like public versus private property, who manages it, what wildlife is protected, and also scientific criteria, meaning that we analyze it from this biotic and abiotic. We don't sit there and try and delineate between like where does public and private property begin. Like, for instance, grizzly bears are not really going to care about administrative standards and limits. They're going to move in and out of the park. And that can, again, have different impacts. So we'll be analyzing these boundaries of ecosystems from both perspectives, administrative and scientific, this year. When we look at an ecosystem, we have different levels of organization. We start with an individual organism, such as this individual alligator here, and then scale it up to a population, which is a group of individuals of the same species in an area, a community, which is all the living organisms in the area, an ecosystem, which is going to include all living and non-living things, so not just the living things like the crocodiles or alligators, the birds, the turtle, and the fish, but also the humidity, the temperature, the precipitation, the water, how much salinity is in it, or what is its salinity. Biome is a large area with a similar climate conditions that determine plants and animals that live there. And then we have the biosphere, which is where all life on Earth resides. Now, many species experience competition, which is the struggle of individuals either between species, which is interspecies competition, or within a species, which is intraspecific competition for a shared or limited resource. So a niche or niche is a role a species plays in an ecosystem, and this can include what they eat, where they live, if they're prey for another animal, are they a predator? It's going to basically be their overall impact on the ecosystem. The more that the needs of one species overlap with the needs of another, the greater amount of competition there's going to exist between them. And this comes to our competitive exclusion principle. Two species competing for the same resource cannot coexist. In theory, one species would outcompete the other and drive them into extinction unless they can adapt to a new niche. This can lead to resource partitioning, which is where competition for a limiting resource can lead to two species evolving to divide a resource based on differences in their behavior or morphology. When competition reduces the ability of individuals to survive and reproduce, natural selection will favor individuals with traits that overlap less with individuals of another species. We can see in the image on the left, we have these three species living in the same tree, but because they occupy different parts of it, the bottom, the middle, and the top, they're able to survive together. And the one on the right, we can see they're feeding at the same beach, but they're getting food from different locations at the same beach. Therefore, they're all able to survive and coexist in that ecosystem. Now, with resource partitioning, again, before we have these different boundaries set, there is going to be some competition. Here we can see that we have these seeds ranging from small to medium to large. Species 1 eats mainly small seeds, small to medium seeds, whereas species 2 eats mainly medium to large seeds. But the ones where it overlaps, like the members of species 1 and 2 that eat the medium seeds, are going to be in competition for each other. So in this specific example, we see that species 1 is a better competitor for the medium seeds, and therefore species 2 is going to have to adapt to survive on eating larger seeds. And that's going to lead to that competition. The only thing that would shift this if there is a change in the environment in which, like, maybe the seeds become less available, or there's less small seeds or large seeds available. In that case, that would lead to more competition and could result in the extinction of a species. Now, resource partitioning can take place in many different forms. Temporal, meaning like time. Species use the same resource but at different times. Example, coyotes and wolves live in the same territory, eat the same prey, but they're active at different times of the day, so they don't overlap. They're not fighting each other for their food source. Plants reduce competition by flowering at different times of the year. Some will flower earlier than others so that they're not competing for pollinators. Spatial. Species reduce competition by using different habitats. Now, we can see here a famous example is desert roots. Some species have very shallow roots to get the water, whereas others are going to dig down deep in order to get it, and therefore it allows more species to survive in that ecosystem. And the last is morphological. This occurs when two species share the same food resource but have evolved slightly different structure to utilize the same resource. Different species of finch in the Galapagos have different beaks to eat different types of seeds. So interactions involving one species consuming another, we're going to talk about predation, predator-prey relationship, parasitism, parasite-host, and herbivory, basically an animal eating a plant. So predation is when one animal, a predator, typically kills and consumes another animal, its prey. Predators can be all shapes and sizes and have different ways of attacking prey. Prey have many different defenses. That's what we see here, this porcupine. They could also be chemical, venom, poison, things like that, in order to try and survive. Parasitoids are a special type of predator where they actually lay their eggs inside of a host. Very similar, again, the large overlap with parasitism. And the eggs slowly hatch. They consume the host that was infected by the parasitoid. Now, parasitism is an interaction in which one organism, parasite, lives on or in another organism, and they typically consume only a small fraction of their host. Ticks, tapeworms, sea lampreys. We'll be talking about ticks a lot this year. And these can include pathogens, which are parasites that cause disease, such as viruses, bacteria, fungi, protists, and worm-like organisms called helminths. Herbivory is an interaction in which an animal consumes plants or algae. We call them herbivores. When boundaries are erected to block herbivores from a certain area, plant growth tends to increase dramatically. We can see in the bottom right where we have a fence set up. The control area where it's exposed to herbivores is low grasses, whereas the fenced-in area, we start seeing larger plants and shrubs begin to sprout and grow. Now, symbiosis is the two species are living in a close and long-term association with one another in an ecosystem. Let's break down the word. Sym, meaning together, bio, living, osis, condition, the condition of living together. Now, symbiotic relationships we're going to look at are mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. So mutualism and commensalism. We looked at parasitism already. So mutualism is an interaction of two species that increases the chance of survival or reproduction of both species. The most famous example is right here, these ants in the acacia tree. The acacia tree supplies the ants with food and shelter, and if anything tries to eat the acacia tree, the ants immediately spring into action and attack whatever is trying to damage it. Another example is plants depend on their pollinators, insects, bats, birds, for reproduction, and the pollinators depend on the plants for food. Coral provides structural support and CO2, carbon dioxide, for algae, and algae provides sugars to the coral to use for energy. Lichens are a mutualistic relationship between algae and sometimes multiple fungi. Algae provides the sugars, an energy source, and fungi provides the nutrients. Now, commensalism is an interaction where one species benefits and the other is unaffected, neither harmed nor helped. Tree branches can serve as a nesting site for birds. The birds benefit, and the survival and reproduction of the tree remain unaffected. Tree frogs use plants for protection. Cattle egrets eat the insects stirred up by the cattle when they are grazing. And golden jackals, once they have become expelled from the pack, will trail behind a tiger and feed on the remains of its kill, very much like a scavenger. So here is a map of all our interactions, talking about negative meaning they're harming, positive meaning that they're gaining, or zero meaning that they are neutral. Now, native species, exotic or alien species, and invasive species. Native species are species that live in their historical range, typically where they have lived for thousands or millions of years. Yes, at one point these were probably alien or exotic at one point, maybe migrated, but over thousands of years they have stayed in the same spot. Certain species can serve as indicators when identifying an ecosystem, and also can actually serve as indicators to tell us if an ecosystem is healthy. An excellent source, if you want to learn more about like the species on Long Island, wildlifecenterli.org. Long Island Wildlife Information has excellent resources on the native species of Long Island. Now, exotic or alien species are species that live outside their historical range. In most cases, species fail to establish successful populations when they're introduced to a new region because they're not well suited to the conditions, and that new population will often die in that new habitat. However, many can live in their new region and have no negative effects on the ecosystem. They just become part of the ecosystem, even though they weren't initially part of it. However, sometimes it can end badly. An exotic species can become an invasive species if it has a negative effect on the ecosystem it's introduced into. An exotic species that rapidly increases in population size and has harmful effects on our native species. And they spread rapidly because they have no natural predators in the ecosystem. They reproduce rapidly usually. And the two examples we're definitely going to explore more in depth this year are zebra mussels that are affecting the Great Lake, and they're introduced by attaching themselves to the bottom of ships that were introduced there, and kudzu vines, which are introduced to the rural South as, we'll talk more about the history later this year, but you can see rapidly spread and cause many problems. All right, make sure you turn in your notes, and I will see you tomorrow.